I would like to introduce our keynote speaker, Stephen Wilmer, who is a professor emeritus, like myself. I'm professor emeritus at UC Santa Barbara. Professor Wilmer is a professor emeritus at Trinity College, Dublin, where he was head of the School of Drama, Film, and Music. He has served on the executive committees of ASTER and IFTAR as also visiting professor at Stanford and the University of California at Berkeley, and research fellow at the Freie Universität in Berlin. He recently co-edited a special topic on theater and statelessness in Europe for Critical Stages in 2016. His latest books are Performing Statelessness in Europe and Life in the Post-Human Condition. He's also co-edited with Jana Merzon the Palgrave Handbook of Theater Migration, forthcoming from Palgrave Macmillan in 2023. So would you please welcome Professor Wilmer?
Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here. I'm going to talk about migration narratives in theater performance. The theater has long been concerned with the theme of migration. From Sophocles' Oedipus Rex to Shakespeare's King Lear, from Bertolt Brecht, Mother Courage, to Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot, homelessness and dispossession have been recurring features of dramatic texts. There are a number of ways that one might approach the topic of migration in performance. However, in order to confine the focus of this paper to a somewhat manageable area, I want to concentrate on the refugee as a symbol of migration, and to consider the refugee in performance both as a theme, a character, and an actor, and to reflect on the role of theater in educating the public about the needs of refugees and the responsibilities of society for their care. With resistance growing to the influx of refugees, theater activists have provided an important voice for hospitality in Europe. In my book, Performing Statelessness in Europe in 2018, I analyzed various strategies adopted by theater artists to address the topic of the refugee, such as adaptations of ancient Greek drama, performative identification, documentary theater, the census and cross-identification, subversive identification and over-identification, nomadism, and institutional responses, particularly in the German theater. I also considered how refugees were not only the subject of such performances, but also developed their own material. Recently, Jana Merzon and I have finished a new book, the Palgrave Handbook of Theater and Migration, which is coming out next month. It's a 60-chapter collection of articles of more than 70 pages, and I would like to have introduced it here as a book, but it's still coming out. The book provides a wide survey of theater and performance practices related to the experience of global movements, both in historical and contemporary contexts. Much of the book centers around the topic of refuge and exile, and the role of theater in addressing these issues. It's structured in 6 sections, the first of which is dedicated to the major theoretical concepts related to the field of theater and migration, including exile, refuge, displacement, asylum seeking, colonialism, human rights, globalization, and nomadism. The subsequent sections are devoted to several dozen case studies across various geographies and time periods that highlight, describe, and analyze different theater practices related to migration. So I just want to run through this to give you an indication of the scope of the book. And you can see that it's not only broad in terms of historical, but also in terms of geography. The number of areas that are covered and introduced. And as you can see, it ends with a chapter on Belarus. It also has a chapter on Ukraine, which is very much up to date in terms of what's happening at the moment in Ukraine in the theater area. So we hope that it will serve as a useful reference work to help theater practitioners, students, scholars, and educators understand this complex field. And for example, if you're teaching or studying theater and migration, it could be a useful resource. I also want to mention that Jana Mirzon and I have just started a new book series on performance and migration. And so we would be very happy if anyone wants to suggest a book proposal to us. So I have a couple of handouts here in the front that you can pick up when you go. One is of this book proposal, which has my email address on it, so you could send me your book proposal if you've got an idea in mind. And also a leaflet about the book, the handbook itself. In addition to our own work, there's an increasing literature in theater and migration. Some of the prominent authors on this topic in English are Emma Cox, Alison Jeffers, Michael Balfour, Charlotte McIver, Sylvia Jestrovich, Thomas Nail, Mark Fleischman, and Agnes Woolley. Their books have focused on migrants in many parts of the world, including Australia, Europe, Africa, the United States, and Latin America. One of the reasons for the interest in this topic is the ever-increasing number of refugees in the world as a result of wars, poverty, climate change, and authoritarian and unstable governments. With the number of forcibly displaced persons more than doubling in the last 10 years to over 100 million, including 8 million Ukrainian refugees and 5 million Ukrainian displaced persons within Ukraine. Moreover, there's no indication that this number is peaking, with projections of 440 million Africans entering the labor market the next decade with slim possibilities of work. Another reason for the interest in the topic is the alarming rise of far-right parties in Western democracies that reached a climax following the sudden increase of migration from the Middle East and Africa to Europe in 2015, and resulted in the closure of many national borders. It's also led to the increasing reluctance of the European Union to assist refugees stranded in the Mediterranean Sea, and European states finding new ways of avoiding the responsibilities to deal with asylum claims under the UN Convention for Refugees, such as initiating legislation to allow them to push back refugees across their borders, such as recently in Denmark, and the UK planning to deport asylum seekers to Rwanda for processing. And if they're successful, they're then allowed to stay in Rwanda. In the last two decades, numerous theater companies and activists in Europe have addressed the precarious position of the refugee in such important productions as Le Dernier Caravansérail by the Théâtre du Soleil in Paris in 2003, Illegal Helfer by Maxi Obexer in Potsdam in 2015, Lampedusa by Anders Lustgarten in Valletta in 2016, Winterreise at the Maxim Gorki Theater in Berlin in 2017, and The Walk of the Giant Puppet Amal by the Good Chance Theater and Handspring Puppet Company in 2021. The question that interests me is how theatrical performance, despite its limitations as an art form, can help to transform public opinion to a more hospitable approach. In this paper, I want to consider two strategies for doing this: documentary theater and performances of subversive affirmation. Documentary theater has been a powerful method for depicting the conditions of displaced people and asylum seekers in the 21st century. Its main function is to persuade the audience that refugees deserve compassion, assistance, and better treatment. In order to do this, documentary theater tends to rely on the notion of authenticity, that the stories they tell and the scenes they portray are not only credible, but also verifiable. There are several different types of documentary theater: verbatim theater, tribunal theater, courtroom drama, docudrama, etc. Verbatim theater uses the actual words of historical or contemporary people. When watching verbatim theater, we can assume that everything that is said on stage was originally spoken or written by a living or a dead person, which is represented or quoted in the drama. Tribunal plays and courtroom drama use this form, where the people on stage are represented as if in a courtroom or portrayed in a tribunal situation where evidence is introduced and witnesses are interrogated using the actual words that they would have used in a trial or in public discourse or private correspondence. Very often what we see on the stage is a set designed to look like a courtroom or a tribunal, with actors impersonating real people who were involved in a trial, or which used testimony that was delivered by real people during a historic event. Of course, this material is edited for dramatic effect, so that rather than presenting the whole trial, which might have lasted for weeks or months, only a couple of hours of the most interesting and dramatic parts of the trial might be presented. Verbatim theater can also use recorded interviews to recreate past stories of refugees. For example, the Ice and Fire Company in England employ verbatim interviews with refugees which have recounted their experience of fleeing their home country. Actors present these refugee stories as monologues on the stage, such as in their show Asylum Monologues. Famous actors of the caliber of Simon Callow and Juliet Stevenson have appeared in Ice and Fire performances, and spectators have been attracted to such events to catch a glimpse of such celebrity actors, as much as for an interest in the material that they're presenting. In some documentary theater, professional actors tend to minimize their histrionic power to increase the credibility of their message. As Derek Paget points out, actors in documentary theater exhibit a presentational rather than a representational style of acting, or what he calls acting in 2D rather than in 3D. For example, actors for human rights who present verbatim stories of refugees are expected to minimize their delivery, often carrying scripts in their hands. When Christine Bacon, the artistic director, is asked by actors how to deliver their lines, she tells them, quote, "What you're doing is you're bearing witness for somebody who cannot be there themselves. You're there to get the words across in a compelling way." She adds, quote, "We're using actors for a reason. They can do that very well," unquote. However, by placing actors on stage to tell a story about refugees, the truthfulness of the story is compromised by the dramatic mode of presentation. As Stephen Bottoms remarks, quote, "Placed within the frame of art, the real is already always representational, and the self always already a characterization," unquote. This is especially true when the actor is a celebrity. Marvin Carlson writes that celebrity status, quote, "is more or less a conscious construct, partly by the audience, partly by the actor, partly by the producing organization, and in more modern times, in significant measure by the media. Celebrity, despite its continual truth claims, exists for its own sake, or for the sake of influencing how the audience values the theater experience," unquote. In some cases, theater companies present actual refugees on stage, acting out their own stories. Like a famous actor on stage, refugees can also have a kind of celebrity status. that marks the refugee actor as distinct from the part that they're playing and creates a sense of double consciousness on the part of the audience. They're seeing the actor, but at the same time, the character. And the fact that the actor is a refugee, they see the actor as a refugee and an actor and a character. While it helps to employ actual refugees as actors in performances to create a sense of authenticity, this does not solve the problem of credibility. Actors impersonating refugees on stage already seem somewhat fraudulent, but the problem of refugees acting as themselves creates a similar dilemma. When refugees perform on stage, they create a tension between the real and the theatrical. Theater is a place of artifice, and putting refugees on the stage automatically creates an artificial location for them. An interesting example of this dilemma was a production of Dear Home Office in London. The play was compiled by British directors who worked with Afghani unaccompanied minors. That's to say that they were under 18 years old. It focused on what it was like for the young Afghani actors to be subject to the whim of the Home Office. When they turned 18, they would have to present their case to the Home Office as to why they should be allowed to remain in Britain, otherwise they would be deported. When they first showed the play in London, the directors of the show held a question and answer session after the performance. Members of the audience advised the directors not to polish and perfect the acting skills of the young Afghani actors, suggesting that their performances should remain raw and therefore more convincing. The spectators argued that the authenticity and strength of their performance came from knowing that the refugees had never acted before. However, the directors of the show rejected this advice because they wanted the refugees to succeed as actors, especially as they were planning to take the show to the Edinburgh Theatre Festival. Employing refugees in a theatrical performance may also provoke ethical questions, such as whether the actors are being treated as commodities by the theater company rather than as individual people. Also, this raises the issue of whether the spectator, in viewing the refugee as celebrity actor on stage, becomes a voyeur of these celebrity actors rather than a witness to their story. In other words, somebody who wants to take some kind of responsible action as a result of seeing the play. By comparison with verbatim theater, docudrama is somewhat different, because it allows more dramatic license. Docudrama might include actual statements made by real people, but it will also include fictional scenes and dialogue that never occurred, for example, between historical characters. There are, of course, theater productions that use a combination of verbatim dialogue and invented dialogue. Okay? And so it's sometimes difficult for the audience to know what was actually said by the characters who are represented or what was invented. In any case, as I've indicated, documentary theater usually happens on a stage, which is a fictional space that is made to represent another actual location. Thus, the audience is asked to imagine that the actors are not simply actors on a stage, but are representing real people in their original locations, for example, in a refugee camp or in a detention center or at their new home. Similar to questions regarding the authenticity and artifice of the performer in documentary theater, the selection of material and the crafting of stories into dramatic narratives are also artificial processes that are disguised to look authentic. As Carol Morton argues, quote, creating performances from edited archival material can both foreground and problematize the non-fictional, even as it uses actors, memorized dialogue, condensed time, precise staging, stage sets, lighting, costumes, and the overall aesthetic structuring of theatrical performance. The process is not always transparent. Documentary theater creates its own aesthetic imaginaries while claiming a special factual legitimacy. So you can see there the tension between authenticity and aesthetics. Thus, we can recognize that theater documentaries are not neutral or objective. The theater director normally has an agenda and intends to put forward a particular point of view, but at the same time wants to convey the impression that their work is objective precisely to persuade the audience more effectively. This lack of verisimilitude can work against the notion that the problems being staged are actual, and this question about authenticity might make the problem seem less urgent to members of the audience. A good example of mixing documentary theater with fiction is Théâtre du Soleil's Le Dernier Caravansérai, which you could translate as The Last Caravan Stop, a 6-hour French play that showed the conditions of refugees in a variety of countries. The title emphasizes the theme of mobility and the need for refuge is expressed throughout the play. The performance was partly based on interviews and partly on moments that were recounted by refugees and recreated as stories for the performance as if they were happening live. The director, Arjen Mnouchkin, and other members of the troupe visited refugee camps in Australia, New Zealand, Indonesia, and France, and interviewed many of the inhabitants, especially those at the Sangatte Center near Calais that functioned as a transit camp, providing accommodation for mostly Iraqi Kurds, Afghans, and Iranians on their way to Britain, and which was later closed by the French government, leading to the inhospitable conditions of the Calais jungle. Mnouchkin and Hélène Cixous, the famous feminist writer who has worked as her assistant or her playwright, resident playwright, and the company devised an episodic play from recorded testimony that they had collected from migrants, and from which the actors improvised scenes along various lines of narrative. The performance, as I say, lasted for 6 hours and was divided in 2 acts. At the beginning of each act, the characters attempt thrilling journeys in dangerous conditions over turbulent rivers and seas, represented by billowing silk fabric. In the second of these, which represents a harrowing sea journey from Asia to Australia, the Australian military arrived by helicopter in what seems like a last-minute rescue, only to announce, "Go back where you came from. Australia will not accept you." Despite its inordinate length, the pace of the production was fast-moving, with short scenes in chaotic order, emphasizing the tumultuous lives of refugees in different countries, enduring oppressive conditions and striving to escape and reach new destinations. As Brian Singleton points out, quote, "It depicts in broad and sweeping performative brushstrokes the causes and more specifically the effects of conflict, migration, and human trafficking, dislocation, and suffering that ensues from that migration." Le Dernier Caravansérai portrays refugees fleeing from many different countries in Europe, the Middle East, Asia, and Africa, including Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, Kyrgyzstan, Bulgaria, Bosnia, making their way to Western Europe as well as to Australia and New Zealand. Numerous escapes scenes take place in which characters try to cross bridges, climb fences, invade tunnels, or otherwise transgress borders. Their migration originates from a variety of causes, with scenes portraying economic migrants, people fleeing war zones, Eastern European women trafficked for sexual exploitation, and members of the Taliban passing themselves off as refugees. The play displays a wide variety of transport, from bicycles and motorcycles to boats, trains, airplanes, helicopters, and on foot. To convey their constant mobility and vulnerability, actors are wheeled on and off stage on mobile platforms by others in the cast. This novel feature elicited numerous comments from critics trying to interpret their use metaphorically. John Lahr describes the production in New York as, quote, "a dramatic inquiry into desolation, a way of making the audience imagine an unmoored life. To this end, dollies, skillfully manipulated by the crew, transport the characters into view and out of sight, like surreal figments in a dream. The refugees constantly scuttle across the vast expanse of the empty stage, propelled as if their feet never touch the ground. Glide replaces drift. The swift movement takes naturalism out of the narrative and gives the people and their stories a sort of mythic metabolism. So you can see in the image there, it's something that just can be wheeled on and wheeled off like a dolly or trolley. Michael Kustoff, seeing the performance in Paris, also commented on the effect of this fluid movement of actors and stagehands. He said, quote, "No one makes a normal theatrical entrance or exit. Each actor is rolled on and off stage, standing on skateboard-like platforms, then pushed and twirled into place by stagehands or other actors. The locations themselves, a house in Kabul, railway sidings in Tehran, are also wheeled on in little trucks. This fluid staging becomes a metaphor for an existence in endless transit, with frozen figures on rolling platforms are in limbo." Another type of documentary theater was Winterreise. In 2016, the Maxim Gorky Theater in Berlin created an exile ensemble of actors to avoid treating migrants like a passing fad, and instead to provide them with some form of ongoing empowerment. Winterreise, directed by Yao Ronen, was their first major production and featured immigrant actors who had recently arrived in Berlin from the Middle East. For Winterreise, Ronen used their usual technique of taking actors on a field trip as a preparation for devising a new play. They took a bus trip to theaters in 10 different cities that would act as partners in the production. Actors kept their personal diaries during the journey, and the company filmed aspects of the trip to include as a kind of visual backdrop for the dialogue. The resulting play was based on the actors' reactions to their new environment in Germany and their personal memories of their earlier lives in the Middle East. As usual in Ronen's other work, the play is highly autobiographical, and the actors used their own names and evidently wrote many of their own lines, rejigging details from their personal experiences or inventing some of the stories. Unlike the normal German tourist visit to the Middle East, Winterreise provided the reverse experience for the audience, who see their own country through the critical eyes of foreigners. The play shows the experience of the exile ensemble as they travel through the countryside. The first stop is the historic city of Dresden. Niels, who is one of the German actors on the far side, acts as their German guide and says he wants to show them historic and romantic Germany. However, as they approach Dresden, he informs them that the anti-immigration right-wing group Pegida, with thousands of right-wing agitators marching every week in Dresden, might be demonstrating outside their hotel. Fearing that the Pegida demonstrators might turn against the actors and attack them, the actors stay inside their hotel. Bus then brings the actors to the historic city of Weimar. But rather than entering the city, it goes to Buchenwald. The actors react with disappointment and anger at being brought to a death camp, since some of them feel that they have just escaped one from one in Syria. The narrative becomes as much about memories of home in the Middle East as about their reactions to German society and customs, with each of the actors revealing many personal details about their past and their fears for the future. Although it's difficult to know the extent to which the actors have invented aspects of their past, their monologues come across as plausible. The play not only concerns cultural difference, but also the loneliness and homesickness of exile. Ultimately, it confronts the central problem of migration, that of longing for a sense of home in a new society. Variations of documentary theater about refugees have been important and useful as a means to bring awareness about the problems of asylum seekers and the conditions that they endure, and to engage audiences in political, social, and humanitarian issues. They might even inform the audience how to subvert government restrictions on refugees, as in the case of Illegal Helpers by Maxi Obexer, which showed ways in which the ordinary citizen could make illegal migrants invisible to the authorities. As it's often accompanied by a post-show discussion, documentary theater can provide a forum for debate about refugee issues and can mobilize support or active engagement, as I witnessed in the performance of Die Schutzbefohlenen in Hamburg in 2014. It can also serve as a form of self-empowerment for refugees who are given the space to tell their own stories, as in Winterreise. In spite of problems with contradictory considerations concerning authenticity and celebrity, and the irony of the refugee actor being both a refugee and a fiction on stage, the impact of documentary theater on the audience lies in the recognition that what they're seeing is evidence of something that really did happen in some form. This simulation of actuality enables the voices and experiences of refugees to be heard and provides a vehicle for persuading an audience that refugees are not just statistics, but have legitimate rights that need to be upheld. Now, I'm going to move on to subversive affirmative performances, but before doing so, I want to show you a brief clip, maybe 2 or 3 minutes, of a film that I've made, which is going to be shown on Friday evening, which is called 1 in a Million, and it's about refugees empowering themselves through theater.
I came from Pakistan. In July 2013, I moved to Germany. Haben Sie Arbeit für mich? Haben Sie Arbeit für mich?
He's asking.
I had this legal visa to come to Europe.
Haben Sie Arbeit für mich?
First, I came to Italy.
Haben Sie Arbeit für mich?
The reason why I came to Germany was because of my education and my working experience.
Hat jemand Arbeit für mich? Hat jemand Arbeit für mich?
As a person, I can say my identity in Germany, the way how I became part of the society, is Refugee Club Impulse.
You are a refugee? Yeah. What the hell you are talking? You want to go to school, you want work permission. If you want to go to school, then go back to your country, apply for study visa, pay the university fee, and then come in Germany, and then you can study. Remember the first day when you came in Germany, you are shouting, my life is not secure in my country. Give me protection. We are giving you free food, we are giving you free medicine, we are giving you free money. You have nothing to do. But when you wake up, you think, oh, I have nothing to do. I should go to office. You cannot imagine the burden at my mind. 1,000 people like you daily come in Germany and we have to deal them. We don't have enough jobs for you. Don't destroy our social system. Just go back to your country. If you have to live in Germany, German rules and regulations are applicable on you and you have to follow them. Keep this thing in your mind.
Butterflies Have Borders, which was the first production. There's a moment in it where he's showing his experience. It's a dance thing, and he's showing his experience through different offices and the bureaucracy in it. And he's got a moment where he's just like shaking his whole body, yeah. And it's a moment, and he's alone on the stage in HKW, which is huge. We had 700 people in there the first time, and he's just like on that moment, and he wants to shout and stuff. And this moment is like he's just alone. I remember it still, the power in it, and he doesn't have to say anything. He's just like, he shows everything through the body.
Yes, so you can see this is an amateur actor, a refugee, using theater in order to express his own identity, also to create some kind of empowerment for the refugees in the group that they were living in the shelter. And it was such a successful performance that it was put on in the Schaubühne in Berlin and several other theaters. So now I want to talk about subversive affirmative performances. Subversive performance uses more devious means to get across its message, such as irony or over-identification instead of authenticity. It might present a provocative or humorous event that exposes and subverts the position of those with whom they disagree, such as done by the Center for Political Beauty, their proposal on behalf of the Austrian government for the construction of the Jean Monnet Bridge from Tunisia to Italy. In the autumn of 2015, the Center for Political Beauty announced via the internet a proposal on behalf of the Austrian government for the construction of the Jean Monnet Bridge from Tunisia to Italy. The proposal was in marked contrast to the anti-immigration policies of the right-wing Austrian government. The Austrian government for many years had been pursuing an anti-immigration agenda. And for example, Sebastian Kurz, the foreign minister who later became the prime minister, proposed that the EU should copy Australian government practices and established a prison colony for refugees on the Greek island of Lesbos. As a subversive ploy, the Center for Political Beauty's proposal claimed to represent the humanitarian attitude of the Austrian government to refugees, stating that the bridge would serve as a lifeline between two continents and a decisive instrument in the fight against people smugglers. In their elaborate promotional video for the project, Christian Conrad introduces himself as the new, quote, refugee coordinator of the Republic of Austria, saying, "I would like to prove that our Alpine Republic can look beyond its own borders and provide great service for the vision of an open and charitable Europe." Named after Jean Monnet, the founding father of the European Union, the bridge would provide safe transportation for refugees from Africa to Europe, thereby avoiding the dangerous boat crossings that had resulted in the drowning of thousands of people. At a cost of 230 billion euro, the construction project was to begin in 2017 and be completed by 2030 as a landmark achievement of humanity and a lifeline between two continents and the largest economic stimulus package in the history of the European Union. In addition to the construction of the bridge, the proposal included provision for the immediate construction of 1,000 floating platforms in the Mediterranean. The Center for Political Beauty launched its first such platform on behalf of the Austrian government in October 2015, calling the platform Elan 1 in remembrance of the 3-year-old Syrian boy whose body was washed up on a Turkish beach. The Center for Political Beauty encouraged other EU states to further this project by constructing additional platforms. Christian Conrad includes in the promotional video, quote, "Austria might be a small state with limited resources, but our most important resource is humanity. Let us turn Fortress Europe into an open house," unquote. The style of the film by the Center for Political Beauty is very professional, and it purports to be a PR film by the Austrian government to show how they're planning to help refugees. However, as you can imagine, the film was completely bogus. There was never any intention by the Austrian government to develop such a bridge. By producing a film that seemed to be coming from the Austrian government, the Center for Political Beauty, which is based in Berlin, was misrepresenting the government's policy in order to embarrass them. One of the most significant examples of subversive affirmation was Bitte liebt Österreich, or Please Love Austria, by Christoph Schlingensief. Schlingensief, a German theater activist, used a technique of over-identifying with the opposition to subvert the position of an anti-immigration party in Austria in 2000. He created a scandalous event in the main square outside the Opera House for the Vienna Festival Week to focus attention on the policies of the newly established coalition government, including Jörg Haider's party. He placed 12 asylum seekers in an industrial container on the main square and asked the public to decide who should be deported and who should be allowed to win prize money, marry an Austrian, and gain the right to remain in the country. Slogans were associated with Haider's right-wing party were affixed to the side of the container, such as Ausländer raus or foreigners out, while the activities of detainees inside the container were transmitted via the internet that participants could watch via video streaming. Schlingensief's satirical event was modeled on a popular Big Brother reality TV show, during which contestants lived with each other in a confined environment called the container. The TV show emphasized that the public could interact with the program by voting whether the contestants should leave or remain in the container, and news programs made daily announcements as to who was forced to leave the show. In the case of the Vienna performance event, Schlingensief raised the stakes by using contestants who claimed to be highly qualified political exiles from various parts of the world and who supposedly faced danger if they returned to their home country. He asked the public to decide which of the contestants should be deported and which should remain. Luc Bondy, the director of the Vienna Festival, wanted to reveal that it was only a performance with actors, but Schlingensief resisted this, insisting on maintaining the illusion that it was a reality show with real consequences. The audience could not be sure if the contestants were actual refugees within the container, if the contestants were actual refugees or simply actors playing such characters, especially because contact between the refugees within the container and the public outside was controlled by the organizers. However, it seems that many spectators believed the people inside the container were actual refugees and the event would have real consequences. But nevertheless, they were willingly engaged in the act of deciding to deport them. Schlingensief himself stood on top of the container using a megaphone, claiming to represent Haider's party. So you can imagine he was actually quite vulnerable to attack. And in a way, I suppose, surprising, it was only after a few days that people did attack him physically and the container. Since it raised uncomfortable associations with the Austrian support for Hitler during the Third Reich, as well as with the recent success of Jörg Haider's far-right party, Schlingensief's event caused a heated discussion in the press. The Austrian government seemed uncertain as to whether to shut down the event and risk accusations of censorship or to allow it to continue despite all its attendant bad publicity. In the end, it ran for the full week of the festival, attracting considerable newspaper and television coverage. Schlingensief claimed that the program was extremely popular and that over 70,000 people contacted the website, which he said kept crashing because of the level of popular interest. His deployment of an industrial container as a symbol of detainment was an inspired choice, calling to mind not only the inhumane detention centers for asylum seekers, but also the numerous tragedies that have occurred in container lorries as immigrants have tried to cross borders illegally. Such a performance, as Schlingensief Peter liebt Österreich, is what Jacques Rancière calls a political dissensus. Explaining this notion, Rancière calls a dissensus, quote, a division put in the common sense, a dispute about what is given, about the frame within which we see something as given, unquote. By contrast with asylum seekers being sequestered away in detention centers, invisible from public scrutiny until decisions are made about their status, Schlingensief placed them in detention in a very public place on a main square of Vienna. So the last piece of subversive affirmation that I want to briefly discuss is Robert Schneider's play Dirt. It uses a specific form of over-identification in which the protagonist, who's a refugee from Iraq, agrees with and accepts the racist comments by his German hosts. Robert Schneider, a successful Austrian novelist, first staged his play Dirt or Dreck at the Thalia Theater in Hamburg in 1993. It confronts the racist attitudes in German-speaking countries against foreign workers and illegal immigrants. The play was so successful that it spawned numerous productions interpreted by various actors toured during German-speaking countries for many years as a one-man show and continues to be performed in German and other languages. Dirt portrays an Iraqi illegal immigrant named Saad, who lives in a city selling flowers on the streets and in restaurants, and who's clearly subjected to racist abuse. Schneider, who had lived with an Iraqi flower seller named Saleh, on whom the play is based, portrays Saad as effectively stateless because he has no rights to stay in the country. In his hour-long monologue, Saad, who says his real name is Ahmed, recalls his life as a university student of philosophy and German culture in Basra before he deserted from the Iraqi army. Rather than standing up to the racial abuse that he receives in his new environment, Saad accepts the criticism of the citizens around him and disingenuously legitimizes the attitudes of German nationalists who want to get rid of foreigners. He agrees that he and his fellow Arabs will damage German culture, and he encourages the audience to take action against him and those like him. In conveying an overly enthusiastic endorsement of German society and dismissing the values of Arab people and culture, he echoes German nationalist attitudes in a provocatively naive manner. Saad's monologue not only endorses German feelings of superiority, but also subtly hints at the difficulties in the asylum process for someone who is illegally in the country and wants to avoid deportation. As the play progresses, Saad seems to become disoriented and starts to identify with German nationalists, adopting their rhetoric as if he's a German nationalist himself, denying his racism as a German while at the same time expressing it. Although the stage directions imply that he is speaking to an imaginary mirror in his poorly furnished room where he and a fellow Arab flatmate cannot afford to pay the electricity, the actuality of the stage space means that he's speaking directly to the audience and confronting them with the rhetoric of German nationalists with whom he cross-identifies. This convention becomes especially explicit at the end of the play as Saad returns to his abject, self-effacing persona and urges the audience to take action to get rid of all the foreigners like himself. As Saad continues to shout the German national anthem, and the noises in the subway drown out the sound of his voice. Schneider employs cross-identification as an artistic tactic for calling attention to the polarity between the citizen and the outsider in society. Cross-identification disconcerting for the audience because the refugee protagonist in the play uses the rhetoric of the nationalist citizen to condemn himself. Saad confuses the spectators on the one hand by assuming that they are racist, and on the other hand by endorsing and legitimizing their racist assumptions. Saad identifies with the audience and cross-identifies with their racist attitudes. This concatenation of opposing values makes nationalist norms seem strange and therefore uncomfortable. So, in conclusion, documentary theater relies on authenticity to convince its audience that something is wrong in society and needs to be fixed, as in Nushkin's Le Dernier Caravanserai or Obexer's The Illegal Helpers. Subversive affirmative performances use various pedagogical devices, such as over-identifying with another's ideological prejudices, as in Schlingensief Bitte liebt Österreich or in Schneider's Dirt, to unmask accepted social norms as something ugly and enable spectators to comprehend social and political issues from new perspectives. They encourage the audience to see the world differently from the way it's been promoted by those in power. In addition to creating sympathy for refugees, as in various forms of documentary theater, they seek novel ways to discredit those who oppose immigration. The advantage of documentary forms of performance is that they can give refugees a voice, or at least present their experiences to an audience. The advantage of subversive performances is that they can be provocative or ironic, create scandals that attract attention, or expose more clearly the position of those who oppose immigration. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much for your presentation. And thank you for being this, giving this overview of theatre migration, these issues. So thank you again for this presentation that gives us this overview. And I just want to zoom in on one of the aspects you were talking about, and with phosphorus theatre. And you had the director's aspirations, you had the audience's aspirations, but I was wondering, the refugees themselves, what were their aspirations in relation to being involved in that process? And do they fit with the directors, or do they fit more with the audience, or is it more ambivalent than that? Say something about that.
Yeah, very interesting question. In fact, I don't know the answer. I can speculate what the answer was, because as far as I know, the actors did go to the Edinburgh Theatre Festival. They wanted to become, if you like, performers who could go on a national stage or international stage. At the same time, there were refugees who wanted to be able to stay in Britain. Of course, they had to be a bit careful about what they could say in the media. And of course, they were concerned about having to appear before the Home Office to justify their rights to stay in the country. So it was a difficult situation for the actors, and particularly because they were young. They were, under 18, and so it's very interesting to know, well, I mean, for one thing, it was a bit difficult for them just to even move around the country to get to rehearsal. Any of them could have difficulties with the authorities, and any of them could be, reach the age of 18 a bit earlier than the others, and then actually had to face the Home Office, and then the uncertainty of whether they would be allowed to stay in the country or not.
I have a question related to what we did with Carlos last year. We asked Carlos to write a play about Gdańsk as the border region. And one of the things, proposals which came to us afterwards, was that we have a lot of refugees here right now, Ukrainian refugees particularly. And one of the suggestions was that this piece could work as a kind of instrument of introducing the refugees who have been welcomed into this society. They are now part of the, the social fabric, schools, they go to schools, etc. That this could be an instrument of teaching them about the history. So about the history of the region, introducing the kind of a local identity and the history of a local identity, as opposed to forcing them to accept a national identity, as Poles. Let's start with the local. So perhaps my question to you will be, what are the efforts of the citizens of those countries? Maybe there's works which are trying to welcome the refugees and make them part of the society. Have there been such works?
Yeah. I think that's a very good point, and there have been. Well, for example, in Germany in 2015, at the time of the large increase of Assyrians coming to Germany, there was a huge effort by theater companies around the country. I think I remember about 160 theater companies organizing welcome centers, or some kind of welcome for refugees, which included, for example, language classes, teaching them how to speak German, and just have cafes where they could hang out, as well as put on plays for them, or plays about them, or plays with them, which was a way of increasing their sense of, if you like, integration into the society. There's a very interesting example that I just showed you a clip of Die Schutzbefohlenen, which was a play by Elfriede Jelinek, Austrian playwright, which was put on for the first time in Hamburg. And in that case, it was done with people from Lampedusa who had come, well, they were originally from North Africa or Africa, and come via Lampedusa to Hamburg, and some of them had been in boats that had had real difficulties. So of course they knew people who had died en route. So the performance then was something which was in a kind of heightened atmosphere of people from Lampedusa who had experienced really treacherous conditions, but they were only in Hamburg under kind of temporary conditions. They weren't to know whether they could remain in the country or not. And so when the performance was put on, they were invited in to watch the performance, but also in some cases to take part in the performance. So when the performance was shown, it was like saying, these people, this performance is about you, but it's also a play about your right to stay here. So the audience, if you like, was faced with the choice: do we do something about these people who are living amongst us, who have had these treacherous experiences? Do we do something to try to allow them to stay here? So as I mentioned, they had a discussion after the performance, and it was an opportunity to meet them, to discuss about their conditions as well as their experiences in the past. And a way of saying, well, now what do we do now? What can we do to help? So it was a way, if you like, of sort of welcoming them, deciding if they can create sort of some kind of platform for them, or some kind of way of giving them assistance, or maybe negotiating with the government to allow them to stay.
Thank you. What about children, the refugee children? How are they? Are you familiar with any works involving the children?
Yeah, I'm just trying to think of children on the stage and how they have been incorporated into performances. Yeah, it'll take me a minute to think of particular ones, but I think that in many situations, refugees are arriving with their families, or children are arriving by themselves. As I say, these Afghani minors are children in the sense that they're under the age of 18, but younger children would obviously need some parents, if they're available, or at least guardians or someone to be looking after them, and could obviously be brought into performances. There was an example of a woman who didn't have a child outside her. She had a child inside her, who was attacked in Vienna in a performance where they were doing a play about themselves. These were refugees from a camp, a refugee camp outside Vienna, and they came into the University of Vienna. They put on the performance, and they were attacked by a right-wing group. And this woman, who was 5 months pregnant, was attacked. Fortunately, she was okay afterwards, but it just shows that it can be quite dangerous for refugees just to perform on stage.
So I had a question in the context of political disobedience, because we've all heard about throwing tomatoes at famous paintings and actions such as Just Stop Oil. And what would you think? What's your reflection on the point of doing that in the form of theater? Is it better? Is it the ultimate answer to solving societal problems?
Yeah, that's a good question about direct action, and how direct action can either be effective or can turn people away from something. What also is interesting in that regard is the effect of a performer or a performance being attacked by say the right wing, which, if you like, can also be an effective form of opposition by the right wing, but at the same time create maybe sympathy for the performers on stage. As I say, in this particular case in Vienna, that obviously created support. The actors stopped the performance because, it was they were attacked on stage, and then they decided after 5 minutes after the demonstrators were taken out of the theater, well, they go on with the performance. So then they went back on stage and they finished the performance. I think there are other examples where you have attacks on refugees or on performances about refugees. For example, in the case of Schlingensief, he was attacked by the left wing because they thought what he was doing was outrageous. And so there was a group of left-wing agitators who came and attacked the container and said, and freed the actors from the container and said, and tore off the sign saying Ausländer aus, and sort of damaged the container's apparatus. Schlingensief then took them aside afterwards and said, look, you've misunderstood what we're doing here. We're trying to support the same position that you have, but you have kind of ruined our performance by, dismantling it. So he negotiated with them, and then they allowed him to put it back up together, and then the performance continued for the next few days. But yeah, it's an interesting question about the effects of direct action.
I read here on the website of Center for Political Beauty that 1 year before you mentioned, so in 2016, they also organized an arena with Libyan tigers. When they were combating them, the refugees were fighting with tigers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was, Center for Political Beauty is a very strange group doing quite provocative things. So in that case, what they were saying was, we want to be able to bring refugees into the country from, I think it may have been from Syria. And in order to demonstrate what they were doing, to make it a bigger statement, they were allowed by the Gorky Theater, on the Gorky Theater's premises, to set up a cage of tigers, real live tigers in the cage. And they said that unless the government allows these Syrians to be flown in, they were going to feed refugees to the tigers. And some famous, I think, Iranian actor said, I volunteered to be the person to be thrown to the tigers if the government doesn't give in. Well, the government didn't give in, but she wasn't thrown to the tigers. But anyway, they've done a number of provocative things. I think maybe the most provocative was when they took the memorial plaques outside the government building, outside the parliament, memorials to people who had died trying to cross from East Berlin into West Berlin and were killed. So these memorial plaques were like created almost like a cemetery near the parliament. And the Political Beauty, Center for Political Beauty, took these plaques away, took them to Morocco, to the fence with the Spanish borderland, and filmed Africans trying to get into Spain, into Europe, holding up these placards. So it was kind of a way of saying, okay, people died died trying to get from East Berlin to West Berlin because of the wall. Now we have another wall, which is a European fortress keeping out refugees. Isn't this similar? But at the same time, obviously, people were scandalized by removing these memorial placards.
We also have a wall right now on the border with Belarus.
Right. Yeah, well, of course, the Belarusian situation was again very provocative, with them sending refugees across and the Polish government sending them back again.
I'm sorry, I've got another question. Well, a comment really. I think as soon as you take theatre away from being entertainment theatre and put it into another situation, which is, I think Szczecina talks about efficacious rather than entertainment theatre, then you have that risk, and actors probably know about this, that you're outside of the normal bounds of what theatre is as entertainment, which is very controlled and everyone knows their place. And as soon as you put them into this other situation, this other space, then all of the rules are taken away and anything can happen, perhaps. Although I think what you're talking about is that these are theatre performances where the kind of entertainment rules would exist. They would like to have that distance where people wouldn't attack.
Yeah, I think that's true. But at the same time, there are performance styles which encourage some kind of interaction with the audience. For example, immersive performances like this, where actors are immersed in it, or the audience is immersed with the actors. So the actors can talk to the audience can talk to the actors as they move around a space, for example. And in that sense, it's not controllable. And of course, you can look back to performances like the Paradise Now by the Living Theatre, where it was very much a performance that could finish or not finish, depending on what happened with the audience.
Okay, Professor Stephen Wilmer, let's give it up to Professor Stephen Wilmer.